Conditional access is one of the most important tools for securing Microsoft 365, Entra, and Azure. But when it's misconfigured, it leaves the door open to token theft, and data loss from BYOD, and way more stuff. One of the questions I get all the time is, what's your baseline policy for conditional access? Well, in this video, Nathan Hutchison and I, MVPs, we're going to go one step further, and we're going to show you how to build your own baselines the right way. So this is part one of a full series where we'll start with the fundamentals, help you design strong conditional access architecture, and then push into more advanced setups later on that deliver serious security. So let's get into it. Listen, the reason we're putting this video together is because every time we do a video on conditional access, there's loads of comments saying a couple things, but the main one is, can we get a baseline of your policies? Right? Because they see me scrolling through a list of like 70 policies, and then folks are like, hey, just give me that JSON file. I want to take it and use it in my tenant. And what I thought would be useful in a video is you and I get together, and instead of just giving folks these policies, explain how to design their own, right? And why we come to the kind of design for conditional access that we typically come for. And so I guess maybe with that in mind, I get some stuff I want to cover. What we'll do is we'll build them together. I'll share my screen. We'll talk through some fundamentals. But you work with customers doing conditional access all the time, right? To get the ball rolling on this, what are some of the kind of big misconceptions, or what are some of the big kind of hurdles you typically see customers face and then help with conditional access?
I guess the biggest one is not understanding their environment and the different types of users that are within their environment. You often see organizations who have put conditional access policies in place, there could be 5, 10, 15, 20, however many. But in reality, nobody knows really which policies apply to which subset of users. So trying to understand the different types of users or personas that are within your organization is probably the biggest issue that I see a lot of organizations have.
Love it. Love it, love it, love it, love it. And I totally agree as well. And with that in mind, almost as if that was planted, honest to God, it wasn't. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen for folks, and we're going to talk through the persona concept that Nathan just mentioned, and then conditional access in general. So I tell you what, let's share screen. So here we go. Here's a conditional access list of policies. You'll see here up the top, I get 66 policies set up. And look, for the point of this video, I'm going to make a few assumptions that folks watching this video, they understand some basics of conditional access and so on. But maybe what I'll call out first of all is that if you really want to get into well-architected conditional access, Nathan, you can let me know your thoughts here, but one of the big flaws I see all the time is there's no naming convention, right? And I'm OCD, but it's not even just OCD, is it, right? It's just about making it easy to understand what policies look like. So what I'll call out for folks is, you'll see straight away, and I'm actually going to try and make this a little bit easier to see on the screen.
And to be fair, just to add to that naming convention piece, is also when people name them incorrectly. When you're looking at a policy 100%. And it's the complete opposite to what it's actually doing, although maybe less of a naming policy issue and more of an understanding issue insofar as how the policy is configured. But I see that a lot, a policy which says this does X, Y, and Z, and in reality, it does none of that.
It's a really great point. For example, and here's another example. If I look, for example, at the second policy in my list here, and by the way, folks, we'll get into why every single one of these policies exist. We'll explain the design thought later on, but we'll stick with naming conventions for now. You see, we got a number. You don't always have to do that. I like it. And then we got a persona, which in the case of the second one is called global. All apps modern MFA. Now that kind of does what it says on the tin. But I guess to your point, Nathan, what you'll quite often see is someone will have a policy that says, hey, all apps have to do MFA, but then there's all sorts of exclusions, and maybe it's not even doing MFA properly and stuff like that, right? So on that point, I'm going to cover two fundamentals before we get into this persona design. Let's head into this policy, right? I just got this in report only mode for now, but I want to cover two fundamentals of conditional access. One is that although down here in the grant, we're going to require a type of authentication strength, which we'll cover later, called modern MFA. This happens after the initial form of authentication, right? So conditional access, it's not going to protect adversaries from potentially finding out that my password is legit, right? Because they can punch that in. So do you maybe want to talk to folks about that? So what does that mean when we say it's post-authentication?
Well, it essentially means that the conditional access policies themselves will not be enforced or will not apply until there has been a successful username and password authentication attempt. So once that username and password, like you say, has been punched in, it's been correct, that's when your conditional access policies will apply. So post-authentication.
Great point. And I'll tell you what, one other thing that's probably worth covering is this part here, right? All resources, or formerly all cloud apps. I guess the reason it says all resources is because now it's kind of expanded into network-based stuff. global secure access, which we'll probably keep out of scope for this video. Folks can let us know in the comments if they want a global secure access video. That might be kind of fun to do. But when we talk about cloud apps, I guess one of the key things to cover here is that we're really talking, we're getting into the kind of, what would you say? We're getting into the realms of understanding the language of OAuth and standards like that, right? Insofar as when we apply conditional access, we are applying it to what it calls confidential clients. So that's like OIDC and its SAML and its APIs, right? It's not what it calls native clients, which my understanding of language basically means that kind of full fat app that sits on the desktop, right? So I guess in terms of practicalities, what does that mean for folks, right? In my mind, it means things like the reason you're seeing MFA in Outlook isn't because of Outlook itself. It's because Outlook is making calls to something like Exchange on the web, right? Is that kind of accurate to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of the case throughout conditional access. You'll find that there's lots of different sort of groups of applications that include all of these, like you say, almost like these dependency apps that sit behind. And in fact, a good example is Exchange Online. If you were to target a conditional access policy with Exchange Online, it explicitly calls out underneath, this isn't best practice because actually OneDrive and Teams on the back end use Exchange Online. You should target the Office 365 app instead. So there's a good sort of a good example of one. Comes under Office 365. Changed it. They changed the name, I think.
Oh, right, great.
Office 365.
But yeah, there we go. Office 365 Exchange Online. Wow, that's not even what it's called, but cool. Yeah, so for example, if I target this, I guess to your point, there's so many dependencies and stuff like that that's going to kick along in the background, right?
Yeah,
cool. That makes sense.
And there's that little section at the bottom if you scroll down a tad. Scroll down a bit more as well. I think it'll tell you.
Oh, wow, we're getting loads of warnings here. Yeah, so okay, gotcha. So it's basically saying they're so heavily intertwined, but if you just choose one, you're going to get all sorts of problems. Cool. I tell you what, by the way, I found out that if you target Exchange by itself, that also actually blocks authentication entirely to Teams. There's a problem I recently had. I was trying to be smart about stuff, but it just didn't work.
I guess that kind of makes sense.
I guess one final, maybe fundamental that we'll cover before we get into the policy design is when we set this up, right? At that point is basically controlling token issuance, right? So the way I think about it, and I'm going to throw up a slide on screen, open here, right? Folks can kind of think of it like this, is we have our personas, which typically is going to be users, right? But you can do it for workload identities, and that gets a little bit complex, but we'll come back to that. Conditional access kind of sits in the middle of your access to these cloud apps. And essentially, so hey, sure, I might authenticate, prove I am who I say I am, but then conditional access is going to control the issuance of those authorization tokens, right? And it's going to say, hey, we're just not going to allow you those tokens, and therefore it's not going to work. So while I got this slide up, what I'm going to do is I'm thinking, let's talk about this concept of the persona, right? Now, you and I probably talk about personas more than like some kind of psychoanalyst talks about a persona, right? It's like, I think it comes from like Carl Jung or something like that, right? But background for this is Klaus Jespersen, who's retired from Microsoft now, but he came up with this concept called conditional access for zero trust, and it has personas. What are the kind of typical personas you see? And maybe we'll flesh those out in this kind of design here.
Yeah, I mean, typical personas are going to be things like administrators or admins. That's going to be your separate cloud only admin accounts. That's probably one that we would see the most, or certainly in every scenario. Maybe internal users, so full-time employees, for example. You could even have sub-personas of those internal employees, dependent on the organization. So, for example, I often see sort of, let's say, VIP users or high-risk users. So,
that's cool.
C-levels, personas such as that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I guess externals, and again, it's going to be very contextual based on the organization and the way that they work. Externals, for example, could be non-full-time employees, but those that have been provided with an internal account, for example. You might want different policies, access policies for those, as opposed to your internals. I mean, you might even have frontline workers separate from internals. They could potentially be a separate persona.
And would you do that as like a sub-persona or a separate?
Probably a sub-persona, yeah. But again, it very much depends.
It totally depends.
Initially, sub-persona probably makes sense. Again, you might have, whether it's a sub-persona or a separate persona, developers, very sort of specific role. And when you sort of tying that back in with your sort of privileged access strategy as well, it's super important to make sure that you're pulling your devs out of your conditional access policies that would typically just target your standard employees.
And the other one that comes to mind for me is going to be that kind of, it's such a recurring type of persona that organizations struggle to appropriately govern, to me, is guests, right?
Yeah.
It's such a can of worms. And I guess, what's your kind of definitional difference between externals and guests? How do you classify that?
Yes, I mean guests. Yes, I mean guests are those that have been registered as a guest member type within your tenant, have been invited. They could be coming in, like you say, from their environment using their corporate email address, or it could even be a personal email address. But they've just initially been invited as a guest into your tenant. And as I say, external is typically, certainly in the scenarios I tend to sort of have worked in, is non-full-time employees but have been provided with some sort of an internal account.
Right, yeah. So it's like kind of contractors and stuff like that, probably, isn't it? That kind of idea. Right,
yeah.
Cool. Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
You might even have service accounts.
Yeah.
One you typically have.
You talk about can of worms, service accounts as normal user accounts, but look, that's the reality of the world that we live in, right? We're not all going to make the move to workload identities anytime soon. So I guess I'm just kind of throwing this stuff on the screen here. When you're working with customers, like what's the sweet spot, or is there a sweet spot in regards to how many personas we have or don't have? Like, I mean, I'll be honest, when I work with customers, I'm kind of like, hey, there's no right or wrong here. There's just what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Is that a fair?
Yeah, you've kind of just hit the nail on the head with the way that you said that. So I think I used the exact same terminology last week, which was there is no right and wrong. It's kind of just whatever's right for you and your environment. That being said, there is a limit, right, to how many conditional access policies you can have within your tenant.
Sure. Yep.
So that's really I would probably say is the first sort of governing factor when I'm sort of helping people plan out their personas.
That's a good point.
Understanding
just double check
that limit. If you start adding, I think it's 160ish or is it 190ish? I forget, somewhere near there.
Yeah, you're on the right track. 195. I just double checked there. So that's a ton of policies, but as we will get to later on, it's you can't hit that, right? Yeah,
I've hit 130, and the thing is as well, the issue isn't necessarily just when you create once you've designed your new policies, it's not necessarily how many policies you've got at the end of that process, because you might already have 30 policies in the tenant, and then you want to go ahead and create all of these new ones on top of that to do a migration to your new framework. You can run into that kind of issue there as well, where you hit that policy cap. So initially speaking, so that's the first thing I would think about, is the sort of number of policies. After that, it really just becomes what makes sense for the organization insofar of the personas that they need, but also thinking about ongoing management. Yes, the persona framework is absolutely easier to scale, easier to manage, but at what point does it become non-manageable because you've got so many personas? So there is a sweet spot, and like I say, like you've said before, there isn't a right or a wrong way to do it. It's just trying to find that sweet spot, which is typically different for every organization.
%. And I mean, one of the ways I've described it is personas shouldn't match your org structure. They're a tool for intra-security boundaries, right? Or something like that. They're not just you know how like with on-prem AD, folks would just create OUs in their exact org structure. And it's like, you don't need to go that far, right? It just needs to represent what you need to have a tiering system and a group policy system. To me, conditional access personas are very similar to that. Because at the end of the day, and again, just to clarify for folks, the whole point of these are to basically align to security policies, right? Who gets access to what apps and how. That's the bottom line. And if you go through a process where, hey, I've come up with 20 personas, but 15 of those personas all share the exact same security requirements, you can consolidate that down to one.
Absolutely. Right? And that's why those persona sort of workshops, if you like, are so important to thrash that out beforehand. Because if you just jump straight into your policy creation and you find that out, however many hours into the configuration, you are going to end up wasting time, right?
Yep, 100%. And so, well, I'll tell you what, I got one final persona I want to throw in there, and then we can maybe talk about the kind of policies that we then target to personas. If I throw this up on the screen now, that's going to be this one, this big controversial one. It's going to be break the last persona, right? Or, hey, you may not want to call it that. It's emergency access, as that struggles to fit in the little rectangle there. But you get the idea, right? And this is emergency access is such a contentious one because, hey, I always joke that you talk to 10 consultants and you'll get 12 different answers on how to manage emergency access accounts and intra, right? I guess you and I, we've probably got very similar approaches. We'll maybe talk about those as we go. But again, I would stress to folks, throughout this whole video series that we're doing on conditional access deep dives, none of this is set in stone and none of it's black and white, right? There is so much nuance to this. And hey, you got to do what works for you. It's just that we've kind of been through the ringer with a lot of stuff, and hey, we get a good idea about what works and doesn't work. So anyway, on that point, we've got a rough idea of what some personas might look like then, and we'll build some policies and show folks the kind of things we want to consider. What are the kind of security mechanisms I need to start thinking about then when I'm putting these personas together, right? So MFA methods is one that springs to mind, right? But what are some of the other key, I guess you could say, security requirements of conditional access that you would then see as common amongst these types of personas?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, it's understanding any of the sort of security considerations that are specific to those personas, right? You know, I'll give you an example. Administrators, you're not going to want administrators signing in from, you know, an unmanaged device, for example. So it's understanding the kind of devices that each persona, you know, might need to sign in from. It's maybe understanding the kinds of data that each persona might be accessing, you know, whether they're going to be accessing sensitive data or not. It might be the applications that they're accessing, which apps do they need to access throughout their day-to-day business. What authentication methods might each individual persona need to use? It's all of these things really that you would typically need to think about when you start building them out.
The point of it, really
high level overview, I guess, of
yeah,
think about.
So, I mean, you mentioned device security, right? And I guess that also device state kind of comes into that, right? Do you allow BYOD or not? You mentioned data security. That's a really interesting one because kind of when you think of conditional access, you think of identity security, but thought there being, keep me honest here, you can't have data security without identity security, right? That's kind of the idea.
Absolutely.
Right. And so that would be things like conditional access app control, right? Depending for cloud apps integration comes to mind.
Absolutely. Or even authentication contexts and authentication strengths when you're looking at sensitive SharePoint sites, stuff like that.
Insider risk management, that's another one. There's a lot of stuff to contend with here.
The more stuff that you integrate with conditional access, the better.
Yes, yeah, 100%. So again, these are the kind of things we go through. And basically what we do is, we'll probably not do it in a whole great deal of depth for the sake of the video, but basically for all these personas you're going through and you're saying, well, I'll tell you what, let's pivot back to the Entra admin center. And if I just pick a random policy, the kind of thing you're thinking about for every persona is what conditions do I need to apply, right? That kind of idea. At what risk am I comfortable with them signing in at? Both user sign-in and insider risk. What device platforms do I want to allow, locations, and all that kind of stuff. And so basically you have to thrash through all that.
Yeah, and it's also sort of digging into them, you know, potentially a little bit further. Locations, for example, all right, so they might be signing in from, you know, a particular geolocation, but it's also understanding, like, are they going to be using a VPN? You know, do we need to take that into consideration? We're going to need to create, you know, trusted named locations. Do we need to add any indicators on named locations into something like Defender for Cloud Apps, which obviously also links back to conditional access and user and sign-in risk?
That's a great point. And so I tell you what, let's nip a contentious issue in the bud right here. One of the common but also controversial conditional access policies you might see is either an IP-based restriction saying, hey, you can't sign in from anywhere that isn't a known IP within the office, or a geolocation saying, hey, we don't do business outside of this country, therefore you're not allowed to sign in outside of this country. I got a lot of thoughts on both of those ones, both the pros and cons. What's your kind of, if a customer comes to you and says, hey, should I bother with location-based conditional access or IP-based conditional access in the first place? What's your instinctual response to that?
Yes, I think they should. Regardless of whether it's geo, IP is obviously the sort of the best scenario if you can restrict it down to, you know, your own ingress or egress points that the company owns. I think that's super important, especially when you're talking about potentially administrators, definitely service accounts. Yes, geolocations, you know, you can get around them using VPNs. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and restrict the attack surface and make it as difficult as possible for adversaries. You know, ultimately, that's what it all boils down to, right? You know, trying to sort of raise the cost of the attack for the adversary. Anything you can do really just to, for the sake of, you know, checking a box and restricting access to only the locations, the geolocations that you sort of work from, you know, that could stop, you know, a low-level attacker from progressing.
Yeah, 100%. And it even just creates enough logs to then figure, oh, hey, someone has successfully figured out someone's password, right? Because they can get that first form of authentication, but then conditional access will stop them actually authenticating. And so, for example, like, let's touch on one of the kind of cool things you can do as you're designing conditional access policies. Is quite common if you do go down the route of having geo-based restrictions to say something like, hey, okay, well, for my internal users, well, we're going to block them signing in from anywhere other than approved countries, right? That's the common one. But hey, what if folks need to travel for work? Or what if they're masochistic enough to want to get work email while they're on holiday or something like that? this is where you really start to play in with the full Entra stack, right? Insofar as, well, hey, let's exclude a group from that block, but then target them with another policy, and then wrap something like, what's it called? Access packages around that, right? And entitlement management. And is that something you see customers do a lot of? Because I tell you what, that's one of those things I always think about. I'm like, yeah, you could do this in principle, but does it add an unnecessary admin burden for the end user? That's what I always worry about. What's your kind of experience with customers there?
Honestly, my experience, every customer goes down that route as long as they've got the appropriate licensing for it, because obviously it's an E5 or an Intra-ID P2 feature is the access packages. But yeah, I mean, everyone I've dealt with, they've had sort of exclusions in place for traveling. Some of them, just like the example that you showed there, is kind of like a basic one. So we've got standard approved countries, and then we've got our approved traveling countries, which kind of makes it a little bit easier. You have a single access package, which allows them to go ahead and request that access while they're traveling. I've also had clients where they want separate policies which will only allow access from certain areas of the world. So, grouped to certain sort of areas of the world, APAC, Asia, all that kind of stuff. I've seen it done a few different ways. Like we said at the beginning, ultimately, it all boils down to whatever's right for your organization and your own risk appetite, I guess, is what it kind of boils down to. So yeah, lots of different ways you can sort of skin the fish, if you like.
Yeah, interesting to find out most of your customers are doing it. I wouldn't say it's surprising to me, because obviously if you're working with a security architect, you're kind of going to lean on the side of being more secure, right? I don't know. I just think back to when I was kind of doing IT management, and I'm like, there's a degree of politics involved with all this stuff, right? And all it takes is one influential user who says, I'm sick of having to fill out a form every time I go on holiday. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think I've been lucky with some of the other clients that I've worked with, to be honest, who have definitely taken the right step forward and sort of tried to minimize the risk as much as possible. So I mean, that's a good thing, I guess. So that's kind of why a lot of the clients I've worked with have gone down that route. But likewise, there's you could also, depending on the licensing, the administrator might want to manually handle those kind of exclusions, in which case you could just use a standard group, which your administrators have to add users into to exclude them. And then usually what I would recommend is you have like an access review on that group, which just periodically kicks them back out in case the administrator forgets. That's a great option as well.
That's a great point. Yeah, let's cover that later on when we cover some advanced stuff, because it'd be good to talk about kind of, obviously, we've worked on policies before where we have kind of exclusions for having to use a compliant device, and you can do some kind of cool stuff with PIM groups and stuff there, right?
Yeah.
So, well, I'll tell you what, maybe even before we get into these these actual policies, we kept talking about personas, right? I think it's worth clarifying. Personas, fundamentally, when it comes to the tangibles, like what are you actually setting up to create a persona? It's basically a group, right? So, for example, if I just go in here and I type in CA-, you can see here a bunch of groups I've created that basically correspond to personas. And I get my admins, I get my emergency access, I get global, which is, again, you talk about 100 ways to achieve roughly the same thing. I've seen global done in a few ways. I kind of like the model where global basically contains every other persona, right? Every other group, kind of like a nested group. But you don't have to go down the route of having a global one. You could just, if you had a policy you wanted to target everything, just add those groups in manually to the policy. And one that maybe we'll talk about this more in detail and later on in the series when we cover advanced scenarios, emergency access and admins. There's some kind of cool stuff you can do to restrict or really secure those groups, right? So I'm thinking of things like restricted management admin units, role assignable groups as well. Is that the kind of thing that your customers are using as well? Because, I mean, hey, if I can play about with a group like admins or access with a lower level of Entra role, that could result in some bad news, right? That's the kind of thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the answer is yes. I see almost all of the clients that I've dealt with have gone down the role assignable groups purely because it's a lot easier to achieve. And there's a lot less barrier for entry, if you like, for learning about things like RMAUs. That kind of has to be well documented. You kind of have to know what the crack is.
Yep.
Whereas at least with role assignable groups, it's reasonably straightforward. That's probably what I see most organizations doing. But both, in reality, if you can get away with implementing both, that's the sort of gold standard, if you like.
That's cool. And I guess as I fumble around here with my screen zooming tool and completely mess up my demo, that's this property down here, right? Hey, I got it. My little Scott Hanselman draw on the screen thing. I haven't set this up as role assignable, but yeah, let's cover that in more detail later on, because I think folks will love the kind of stuff you can do there. So, hey, you set up your groups, you add users into them, Could be a static group, could be a dynamic group, right? It's kind of, it depends, I guess, for that. Do you have any thoughts on, because hey, dynamic groups, goodness, yeah, they can have some challenges, right? What's your general approach to static versus dynamic when it comes to personas?
So, like you just said that, I'm a really big fan of dynamic groups. I think wherever possible, if you can automate it, absolutely. If you can automate it natively within Entra, even better. So yeah, dynamic groups is definitely the way to go in the long term. When you're looking at implementing a new sort of set of conditional access policies, though, you're obviously going to want to sort of test it out slowly. Yes, you've got report-only mode, which is fantastic. There's a lot of stuff you can do there. Honestly, I think report-only mode has its place, but I think the best way to do is just get policies switched on, communicate to some pilot users, and start testing in the real world. That's how you get things done quick, is the honest truth, is learn from the end users. And the only way to do that is using static groups for your initial rollout. Once you've got to the point where you're, 95% of the way there, that's when you start thinking, right, okay, how can we make this a little bit more efficient for us moving forward? Which of these persona groups could be dynamic groups? And that's when you would look to implement them. That's sort of my usual strategy for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that would be, so you kind of have a pilot phase with multiple rings that are done statically. And then when you're confident enough in that, that's when you go, hey, let's put this to dynamic and base it on that rule. That makes sense. So tell you what, let's dig into high level of what architecture might look like for all these policies. Took us long enough to get there, but I think we've covered a lot of these fundamentals now, and that'll give folks context. I'm going to start with one that I don't often see, but I love, is this one here up the top, right? And it's, can I do the zoomy thing? Yeah, there we go. We can zoom. Unspecified all apps block. And really the idea behind this one is kind of risky, right?
Brutal.
You could break a lot of stuff here, but yeah, let's run through it. So we're basically saying all users, except users who have a persona, no matter what you're accessing, so all resources. We've got an exclusion in here that, I mean, you and I have spoken previously about exclusion management and conditional access. That can be a real nightmare. We'll maybe cover that later on. So yeah, if you are all users and you're not in a persona and you're trying to access anything, we're going to block access. That's a heck of a policy, right? Do your users kind of go full hog and go with that? Or if they do, where does it kind of sit in their maturity model?
Yeah. Yes. Again, I've been lucky enough to work with clients that have wanted to go ahead and implement that policy. It is absolutely the last and final policy that gets enabled. After everything has been tested, after everything has been rolled out 100%, that's when that policy gets enabled. But I'm the same as you. I think it's a great policy to have, without a doubt.
Cool. Okay. So point here being, do this last.
Do it last.
And maybe run it in report only mode for a while.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
only mode. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And hey, we'll maybe keep saying we'll come to it later, but honestly, we'll cover the high level stuff first and then we'll come back to more specific details. To me, emergency access persona, first thing, like as soon as I hit new conditional access policy, first thing I do before I touch anything is add in the persona for emergency access, right? So that, hey, if I do break everything, I can always get back in. So that
Microsoft they should build something in Entra ID where you can specify your emergency access accounts or emergency access groups, and it just automatically excludes them from policies unless you
kind of built in
include it. Yeah, you should. Yeah. That'd be quite good.
I've seen other folks recommend that, and it kind of surprises me that it's not there because they call it out in their docs, right? And they say, hey, you should have these break glass accounts. It would be cool if it was a built-in capability. The thing about having it, well, yeah, sure. I mean, it's because it's one of those things where it is kind of high risk doing it. I sometimes wonder, is that the reason they don't offer a native solution? So
yeah, I can imagine it is. I mean, if there was still that sort of, well, you have to go in and sort of explicitly enable it for the policies. Plus, you have to explicitly say these are your break glass accounts or this is the break glass group. Then I feel like, that's still kind of putting the ownership onto the tenant administrator. But I don't know, maybe just
no. Listen, I totally agree. And so I'll tell you what, let's talk about some of these global rules. And to me, global basically means, hey, this is a policy that is going to apply to everybody, right? It's kind of a fundamental policy that you may have some exclusions, but on the whole, this is going to apply to the bulk of your users. We popped into this one earlier. Let's head back in there. And it's all apps, modern MFA, right?
And it's just
self-explanatory.
Yeah, and it's just worth sort of mentioning here as well, because we've talked about all apps or sort of all resources. That is, and we've talked explicitly about the persona-based framework, but what we're also looking at here is a conditional access for zero trust, right? The zero trust framework. By applying it to all resources as opposed to targeted applications, that's sort of following the principles of the zero trust framework.
Yeah, it's about trying to include everything by default and then exclude things only when it's absolutely necessary rather than vice versa. I kind of think of it as kind of like allow listing versus block listing, right? And we know that allow listing is fundamentally the right way to do security in almost all circumstances. Sometimes you might get a little bit more admin overhead, but you do get the security benefits. And I'll tell you what, something that maybe we should start exploring is if we head down to the grant control here, something that can catch up a lot of folks is these two options here, right? You can either require multi-factor authentication or you can require an authentication strength. And I've set this to be an authentication strength I built called Modern MFA. Maybe you can comment on the fundamental difference here? Like, I feel like we're just confusing users, but it's important stuff.
Yeah, it is. And they should probably do a better job of calling it out in the conditional access policy configuration page, really. But ultimately, the top option that you had there, require MFA, will allow any level of authentication strength to satisfy that control check. Whereas authentication strength, sort of predefined sets of authentication strengths or authentication methods that you can define. There's a couple of built-in ones there, but you can create your own custom ones like you have on screen now, which you can then use within your conditional access policies. So for example, if maybe you want to allow SMS within your environment, don't ever do it, but maybe you want to allow SMS for a subset of users, right? But you don't want to allow it for, the majority. Well, rather than, allowing the use of SMS as an authentication strength within conditional access policies, you could have a separate policy which completely removes the SMS option within that conditional access policy, and therefore sort of really limit it down to the end users that can use SMS. Because obviously just unchecking or removing those users from the authentication methods policy isn't enough, because if those users that have been, for example, excluded from SMS within the authentication methods policy had already registered for SMS, that's an authentication method that exists against their account. So if they're then allowed to use any authentication method within conditional access, despite the fact that they're not targeted in the authentication methods policy, they can still sign in using SMS as an MFA, or roundabout way of saying use authentication strengths.
That makes a ton of sense. And so to clarify the kind of terminology, I guess, so an authentication strength is a collection of authentication methods, right? So method is the kind of the individual type of thing. And if we talk about the kind of hierarchy of authentication strength, phish resistant MFA, and there's a few different types, it's kind of sitting at the top of the hierarchy, right? Because you get all those protections against adversary in the middle. And hey, basically any type of auth that's using crypto is going to be stronger than ones that don't use crypto, with a few nuances, but that general idea. And so what I've done for this particular tenant is we've got one that's called Modern MFA. To your point about SMS being a particularly common one to avoid, this is basically inable to most types of MFA that aren't SMS. And I guess the cool thing is, to your point, you could then have different rules for different folks, right? So you could say VIPs need phish resistant MFA, but everyone else will just accept any type of MFA. That kind of idea, is that what you're...
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Next up, so that covers our kind of rough speaking our MFA guidelines. Another policy that's quite common is this one here called register or join devices. And that kind of takes us on to this concept of not just targeting resources or cloud apps, but targeting user actions, right? I find this one a little bit, if I'm speaking honestly, I find this one a little bit limited. I wish there was kind of more stuff here. There's a few things that come to mind that I think should be here. When we talk about registering and joining devices and requiring MFA for that, that's it, right? That's the kind of idea there, right?
Enter join, or like you say, enter registration. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and making sure that you've got MFA on that particular user action. So, registering a phone, when you're sort of going through the process of setting up Microsoft Authenticator, that will typically register, the mobile phone. Or like you say, if you're going through autopilot or, joining a device to enter, any of those sort of user actions will then effectively trigger this policy, require MFA.
It's interesting because we were just talking about authentication strengths, right? And you kind of read here and it says only require multi-factor authentication can be used for this. And sure enough, that is the only one you could use. A little bit of catch-up needed between these different kinds of conditions. Right? I'm not aware of a reason, other than probably it was the only supported scenario in the first place. Like they didn't want to limit it to just IPs or something like that. Because, hey, you could customize a full conditional access policy. That's my guess. But yeah, interesting one. Because what I'm also wondering is, would this support send-in frequency of every time, right? This is something we'll talk about more later on. But if I've got a stolen token, could I then use that to register or join devices if it's got an MFA claim in it? I have no idea. That's something to...
It's one thing that always comes up a lot for me as well is, well, if I've got let's say you've got your global policy which is set to all resources or all cloud apps, would that still satisfy MFA for registering or joining a device? Because I get asked that a lot.
Fine.
And at least from my experiences, the answer to that is kind of yes. Every time I do an Entra join, a registration, if you've got an all cloud apps or all resources policy that requires MFA, you're going to hit MFA as part of that process.
That's a good point.
So this is, I find this is more of a sort of best practice approach. When you look inside the Entra ID device settings section, Microsoft sort of explicitly call out, you should switch MFA off here and have a conditional access policy in place if you're using conditional access policies. So it's more of a best practice thing than anything else, I think.
Yeah, really good point though, because you'd think that just all cloud apps would cover that, right? Because, hey, if you're joining, then surely you're touching a cloud app at some point. Interesting one. Okay, so that covers that one. Again, just a global good standard. Legacy off and blocking it. I think most folks kind of know this one by now, right? I don't want to make any assumptions, but basically, this is where we head in here and we say, hey, if you're using legacy auth, which basically means any type of authentication protocol that doesn't support MFA, we're going to block access. And you typically do that across a whole environment. I guess you mentioned service accounts earlier, right? That's a common exclusion for this type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Common exclusion. And it's the kind of thing, like you say, where you would probably exclude them from the policy, but then you would back it up with a separate policy specifically for that service account or for that set of persona, and then maybe restrict it to certain IPs is usually what I would recommend, something like that.
Makes sense. And two other ones which target different things but very similar in idea. Not always achievable, but hey, it's in this baseline. All users, all apps, if it's a high-risk sign-in, block it, or if it's a high-risk user, block it. Now, the high-risk user blocking them, I think that one's safer than a high-risk sign-in because a high-risk user typically means it's guaranteed, hey, Microsoft have noticed your credentials have been breached and they're all verified. They check it is indeed the right credentials. A lot of folks will use self-service password reset. They will use you force the user to change their password in that scenario, right? And I guess whether you block them or whether you force them to change their password, it all boils down to your own individual risk appetite, right? And how much risk you're willing to tolerate or user overhead you're willing to tolerate.
Absolutely. You kind of hit the nail on the head there. So this is obviously using, for clarification, this is obviously using Entra ID protection. So that does require Entra ID 2 in order to use this functionality. But the key thing there is you've got granularity. You've got these different risk levels. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. That's something that I usually come up against with a lot of clients in the past is they think it's all or nothing. Well, then that's just not the case. In this case, we're saying, well, okay, if the sign-in risk or the user risk is high, block the account, and that's ideal. You might say, well, we're okay with allowing users to remediate their own risk, with a password reset, for example, or by enforcing MFA, if it's a low or a medium risk. So I think having that granularity is key there and understanding that. And that's why, like you've just sort of said there, in this baseline for the global persona, for every persona, blocking high risk, I think is a sensible option for all of the personas, really.
And as you're saying that, what I'm also thinking is just because in the baseline we're doing it for everyone, there are scenarios where if you block maybe a VIP user or someone like that, that could be a resume generating event. So, for example, kind of counterintuitively and almost perversely, you might end up in a scenario where that VIP persona we were talking about earlier, maybe they don't get blocked. Maybe it just raises a kind of high priority incident for a security engineer to go away and investigate. That's something that can be quite common as well. Point here is push security as far as you can, right? I guess there. And sign-in, just to clarify for folks, user risk and sign-in risk, they are different. Sign-in risk being unique to that specific sign-in and user risk being kind of a consolidation of a whole bunch of different risks. Next one up, we usually recommend everyone block by default. If you can get away with it, there's some gotchas, is device code flow, right?
Was in the news recently, I think February, middle of Feb. Microsoft updated their blog on it.
Yep. It seems to be in the news a lot in terms of being a very common phishing vector. So just to clarify, I think we put a video about this out separately on YouTube. You can check out the channel or we'll try and link to it. This is basically phishing protection, right? I can think of a few scenarios where you can't actually do this for some users. Real world, when you're in there doing conditional access for customers, what are you able to get away with? Are customers just going in and saying, hey, yeah, lock this down? Or are they having to have exclusions and stuff like that?
Yeah, again, and maybe I've been lucky with mine, but for the most part, we just go ahead and we block it. There are, I forget what it is off the top of my head, but there are ways you can run through the Entra ID sign-in logs to find out if anyone's actually using device code flows. That's typically something you could maybe do initially just to get an idea of, what's going on in your environment. But for the most part, like you say, most sort of standard users never really need to use device code flow. It's typically administrators when they're doing initial setups and sign-ins of things like, headless Teams phones and that kind of stuff.
Great point. I think, is it Azure CLI uses it or something like that as well? Teams phones, like you mentioned, they can use it as well. Check those logs before you go away and do it, I guess.
And I don't think I know. I think because you've got device code flow and then authentication transfer, which is the scanning of the QR code when you're setting up Outlook.
Yeah, literally just about to head into that one. So if we head down here, folks, and we go, so conditions, authentication flows, and you'll see the two options here are device code flow and authentication transfer. I never see this anymore. I used to see it, you'd set up Outlook and it would say, hey, do you want to set up Outlook on your phone as well? Scan a QR code, like you said, and all that. I don't know if it's been deprecated or what, but I just never see it now.
I think that's
Let us know in the comments if you do, but have you ever seen it?
Well, I've definitely seen it, but likewise, I don't see it as much anymore. I think it's probably more boils down to the fact that organizations are using Intune and pushing out Outlook configurations. So by the time you open Outlook, it's already pre-signed in.
Yeah.
So you're not doing that actual manual sign-in process. I think it still pops up. But like you said, 9 out of 10 times, like no user's going to bother scanning the QR code to go and set it up on the phone. They're not that bothered usually.
I agree. Also, just sounds like a accident waiting to happen, right? I'll scan a QR code and I'll hand over your, well, thank you. Okay, right. A few more global ones to run down. And again, everything is kind of, your mileage may vary, blah, blah, blah. This is just the kind of baseline that we can look at. Hell, heck of a mouthful, this policy. But it's basically what we're saying is in this naming convention, we're saying, hey, here's a persona, here's what we're targeting, and here's what we're doing. So we're basically saying we're going to target low and medium risk sign-ins, and we're going to require a sign-in frequency of every time. And we're just going to apply that across the board to all users. So what does that look like? Well, hey, we've got our global persona. We're targeting all cloud apps. The condition is a sign-in risk of medium or low. And remember that we are targeting high separately, so we can kind of forget about it for this case. And the sign-in frequency is going to be every time. This is kind of a cool feature. And did it recently go GA for PIM as well? I think I've seen, I'm not entirely sure.
Something like that. Potentially, yeah.
Do you want to talk folks through why is this useful, right? Because
it's useful because a sign-in frequency is going to re-trigger authentication, right? It's a re-authentication. So in this case, any persona that is within that sort of global persona, anytime they perform a sign-in and that sign-in risk is considered low or medium, it's going to trigger a re-authentication, which in theory should then also trigger MFA. So that's why it's important. You want to make sure that you're doing a re-authentication in that particular scenario.
Great point. Is really just going to force them to go through every other conditional access policy that's in scope for them, right?
Yeah.
And just so folks are aware, there is a built-in kind of threshold of 15 minutes. So when it says sign-in frequency every time, it kind of means sign in if it's been longer than 15 minutes. Reason for that is when you sign in, you're probably signing into like 20 or 30 apps under the hood that you just don't see, and you don't want to get bombarded with MFA claims and stuff like that. But hey, this is the main thing we're targeting this for is like token theft and stuff like that. Register security info. By gosh, if I had £1 for every time I had to contend with registering security information, keys and BYOD and a whole bunch of stuff we can maybe cover later on, or maybe it needs its own video. And this is a real minefield, right? What does it mean in principle? Like, register security information, what's that all about?
Yeah, so that's essentially registration of your authentication methods, your MFA methods, if you like. That's going to happen either through the interrupt wizard, which could be part of the registration campaign, for example. When the user first signs in, they're prompted to set up MFA. That's going to add their authentication methods. That's essentially registering security information. You can also do it sort of directly from the My Account page, going into the security information there. Go ahead and manually add a new authentication method in there, a new MFA method. That all of that process is registering security information. And essentially what this policy is doing, kind of similar to the previous one, is anytime a user goes to perform that particular action, it's going to require re-authentication. So enforce MFA again, apply all those policies again, make sure you satisfy them, then you can add your new authentication method or your new MFA method.
And I guess, again, one thing we didn't really explore in a lot of depth is your core idea behind protecting this is like, it's if a token has been stolen from the device or something and the adversaries try to register their own.
Absolutely. Malicious MFA, yeah, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's kind of what you're trying to protect against in this particular scenario. Frustratingly, though, when you're looking at deploying these policies, in this sort of zero trust approach as well, and we'll probably get onto it later or in another video, the amount of dependency applications that sit underneath this register security info is just crazy.
Yeah. Keep me honest here. I'm trying to think off the top of my head what the exact problem is, but one of the advanced scenarios we'll run through later is if, let's say, for BYOD as an example, I want to block every app other than Office 365, right? If I go down that route, I say, hey, all cloud apps block except Office 365. I can't add an exclusion for register security information, can I? Because it's not an app, it's an action. Which,
absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's infuriating.
And there's lots of different apps that are required on the back end to actually get into the security info page. There's a whole set of apps just to get to the page, and then there's more that sit underneath it to actually register the security info. So yeah, bit of a nightmare.
Okay, so that's almost us done with our global policies, which cover a lot of the fundamental things you need to know about conditional access. The next ones on this list here is, folks, what you'll see is a auth context, right? So global auth context and a whole bunch of different things. If we head over to this page here on the left, authentication contexts, and then I click in here, these all have to be created manually, right? These don't exist out the box. But you'll see here, they're kind of just like requirements for something, right? So require a hybrid join device or passkey or Windows Hello or re-authentication. And if I click into these, and I'll jump from one to one, you can kind of see it's literally just a name, a description, and publish to apps, right? The authentication context itself doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, I usually sort of just label them as tags. I just usually say authentication context, use a tag, essentially.
That's a great way of putting it. And so we got these tags, and we link those tags to conditional access policies. That's the list, the little list here. When I'm setting it up, I usually do it globally because I think intuitively it makes sense to say, well, if I've got a policy that requires Windows Hello for Business, for example, it makes sense that that should kind of apply globally, right? Just to not confuse things. And so what you'll see here is rather than targeting a cloud app or a user action, we target one of these tags. In this case, Windows Hello for Business, and then we say, hey, require Windows Hello for Business. The kind of places we might see these, well, it's kind of, let me know how you describe it, Nathan, but the way I typically describe it is like, if you want to invoke conditional access in the middle of an app experience, rather than at the point of sign-in, that's where authentication context comes into play. So for example, let's say you're signing into SharePoint. Most of these conditional access policies, they're going to apply at that first initial point of sign-in. But then if I go to a specific SharePoint site that is, hey, maybe it's sensitive, it's got top secret stuff in it, well, I can tag it with one of these authentication contexts. It's going to force conditional access again. So as an example, hey, allow SharePoint on BYOD unless it's got the authentication context called compliant, in which case you have to use a compliant device, which typically is going to mean it's a corporate device. That's the way I typically describe it. Is that?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I usually go with where you want to apply some sort of additional action to something, to a particular process within Entra, and obviously there's different places within Entra that kind of support it. You kind of used the example there of applying an auth context to a SharePoint site, which is then going to trigger the policy. The other place that you could obviously use it is, privileged identity management is where we typically see it being used at the most. Without using authentication context in PIM, I would argue that if you're using the built-in one, you're definitely running under a false sense of security because that is not protecting your PIM activation into those eligible roles. So yeah, that's sort of, I guess I would sort of explain it in the same way, maybe slightly different wording, but yeah, same.
Great point about PIM. Totally forgot about that. We should do another video on PIM. But let us know in the comments if you want a kind of same kind of idea about architecture of these things. PIM would be a good one to cover. So yeah, look, that covers all the kind of the global ones and a lot of the common conditional access policies that you'll see. What you'll see is, as very quickly scroll down through the rest of this list, are some more specific scenarios per persona, where for admins, hey, we want to throw away more security at them than other users. Same for internals. Externals, they'll be different again, and so might guests and service accounts. And finally, those emergency access accounts, they're going to be different as well. One final thing just occurred to me we never really mentioned, but just for the avoidance of doubt, when folks look at all these policies and they think, hey, there's so much here, I kind of want to explain two things behind the reasoning of that. First off, is that when you work with conditional access, kind of just think of it that everything applies all at once, right? Insofar as anything that I'm not excluded from, anything that matches my sign-in, conditional access is going to apply all those policies all at once. So it's cumulative. So for example, if I scroll up and I say the global policy to block high-risk users, and then I think I've got an admin policy to also block lower medium risk sign-in users, well, both of those are going to apply. And so if I'm an admin under this model, it's going to block me if I'm low, medium, or high, right? So it's just, think of it as everything thrown at the wall and it sees what sticks. The other reason, and real interest to find out what your customers think about this, Nathan, just in terms of the sheer number of policies that the way you and I architect conditional access. A lot more policies than a lot of customers may be used to or expect or things like that.
Yeah.
The main reason for me for that is it allows such a degree of fine-tuning and granularity and also exclusion management. Would you maybe want to put a little bit of meat on the bones about what I mean by that and how your customers experience it?
Yeah, and look, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you initially look at these, when you show anybody these list of baseline policies, they go, "Yeah, that's more than we can handle." But the truth is, once you kind of get over that initial shock that you're going to have more policies within your environment, once you start going through that build process and you start implementing it, you kind of just hit the nail on the head. It actually becomes considerably easier to manage your conditional access policies, because the policies are essentially only applied to the subset or to the persona that you're targeting, right? So you're never troubleshooting 66 policies, against a single user. You're actually troubleshooting maybe 20 of those, and it does make it a lot easier to sort of troubleshoot and scale outwards. But then likewise, like you were saying there, with regards to exclusions and granularity, which is probably kind of the biggest benefit, is that you can make those sort of minute adjustments and ultimately close those gaps within your access control policies as much as possible. I think it's really important to kind of go down this route, but totally appreciate the first time you look at these policies, it's like, wow, yeah, especially if you're an organization that's got 5 policies, it can be a bit of a shock to the system initially, but long term, it is a lot easier. At least with the clients that I've dealt with, maybe I've been lucky. They've been well on board with taking on the full policy set and implementing it as much as possible, which is really good to see.
It's good to get that validity, right? That customers do come around to this way of thinking. And I'll tell you what, maybe I'll see if I can jump into policy to maybe explain your point about exclusion management insofar as, let's build a policy from scratch. A common one might be, hey, all users or a certain persona, I'm going to need them to do MFA. I'm going to need them to be a compliant device. I'm going to need them to be hybrid. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. So all of these controls are required, right? Now, you will run into a scenario almost inevitably where, hey, the user's lost their phone. They can't do MFA at the minute. That's maybe a poor example. Maybe a more accurate one might be, hey, user's laptop is bricked. They're going to have to use BYOD for a week. And hey, the business has accepted that risk, but you're just going to have to allow that. Now, if I go in here and I say, okay, well, I'm going to exclude that specific user from this policy, then not only am I excluding them from requiring that compliant device, I'm excluding them from loads of different security requirements, right? And so if you break that down to have a policy for this, policy for that, and a policy for the other thing, it allows that fine tuning, to your point.
Yeah.
And it's just vastly reducing your risk that you'll forget to tidy this up at the end of the day, because we see that all the time, right?
Totally agree. Yeah, absolutely.
One other thing that might be worth pointing out is if we head to sign-in logs, I think I'll have one recent here because I just signed into this portal, obviously, to record the video. If I jump in here and I head to conditional access, well, it's only going to show me the ones that kind of matter, right? It's not going to bog me down with tons and tons of ones, to your point about troubleshooting. So that's the kind of thing that informs the design decision, I guess, here.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, we covered a ton here, right? Covered a ton of fundamentals and also some advanced scenarios. Let's follow this up with part 2. And in part 2, what we'll do is we'll cover some specific thinking and logic behind persona relative tasks. As I scroll through here, we'll see why are some scenarios where you might want to have a different sign-in frequency? Why might you want to have different kind of BYOD rules? And then maybe if you and I are feeling insane enough, we'll start talking about service principals and adding service principals and tagging them with custom attributes, where you can really go kind of hardcore with security and conditional access and flip it into kind of an allow listing mode by default, right? Which ain't for the faint of heart. It can really make conditional access very, very powerful. If you found this video useful, make sure to subscribe to us and check out the next video in the series, where we'll dig into some really advanced applications of conditional access to make your Entra ID security as robust as possible.